The apartment above the laundromat on Birch Street smelled like warm soap and something faintly metallic, the way old pipes smell when the building heats up in the morning. Lee Calloway had lived there for 8 months, long enough to know that the third step on the staircase creaked at 2 in the morning, long enough to know that the spin cycle of the industrial washers below hit at 11 at 1 and again at 3:30, and that if she pressed her palm flat against the floor, she could feel the vibration move through the concrete like a slow pulse, long enough to stop noticing it. The apartment was a studio, one room with a kitchenette along the east wall, a bathroom with a shower head that ran cold for the first 4 minutes, and a pull-out couch where Sadie slept on weekends. The window above the kitchen sink faced the parking lot. In the mornings, if she stood at that window long enough, she could watch the sky go from black to gray to the particular shade of pale blue that meant she was already running late. Lee kept a list on the refrigerator door. She had written it in black marker on the back of a takeout menu, 2 columns side by side. The left column said pay now. The right column said pay when you can. She updated it every Sunday night before she went to sleep, and every Sunday night the right column was longer than the left. It had been that way since the divorce was finalized 8 months ago, and before that, it had been that way for longer than she cared to think about. Only back then, the numbers were organized into a joint account with Garrett's name on it, and the weight of them was distributed between 2 people instead of one. She worked mornings at a diner called Rosewood on Route 12, the kind of place with vinyl booths the color of old mustard, and a pass-through window where the short-order cook, a barrel-chested man named Hector, who had worked there for 19 years, slid plates across the ledge without looking up. Lee poured coffee, refilled ketchup bottles, wiped down tables, carried plates, smiled at strangers, and on a good morning, walked out with $42 in tips. On a slow morning, it was closer to 18. On a bad morning, she didn't count until she got to the car, because counting in the parking lot of the diner felt like something she wasn't ready to do in public. Nights she drove 25 minutes east to a fulfillment center off the highway, where she packed boxes until 2 in the morning. The fluorescent lights there were the kind that buzzed at a frequency you couldn't quite hear, but could feel behind your eyes after the third hour. She wore steel-toed boots and a badge on a lanyard and moved through the aisles with a scanner pulling orders, boxing them, sending them down the belt. She got home at 2:30. She set her alarm for 5:50. She did it again. Sadie was 9. She had Garrett's coloring dark eyes and brown hair that went wavy when it got long, but she had Lee's way of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something, a stillness that settled over her like she'd stepped outside of time for a moment. The custody arrangement approved by a judge in Raleigh County 6 months ago gave Garrett Sadie from Sunday evening to Friday morning. It gave Lee the remaining 48 hours. A lawyer Lee had found 3 days before the first hearing had not pushed for more, and Lee had not pushed the lawyer, and by the time she understood the full shape of what she'd agreed to, the paperwork was signed, and the judge had moved on to the next case. Weekend morning, she picked Sadie up from Garrett's house on Elm Fork Road at 9. Sadie was usually already on the porch, waiting, her backpack on her shoulders, her library book in her hands. She climbed into the back seat and buckled her belt without being asked, and they drove to wherever they were going that Saturday, the grocery store or the park or the Dollar Theater on 5th that showed movies 2 months after their release. And Lee did not think about the list on the refrigerator or the spin cycle or the way the fluorescent lights made her eyes ache. She thought about Sadie. She let herself think about just that. She didn't talk much about the divorce. Not to Rowan at the diner, who was kind enough to ask the right questions and wise enough not to push when Lee changed the subject. Not to the women at the fulfillment center, who had their own troubles. There was nothing to say that would change the numbers on the refrigerator door. There was nothing to say that would add a 5th day to the weekend. So she worked and she slept in 4-hour increments, and she kept the list, and she carried something unnamed in her chest that she had not yet found the right word for. She had stopped thinking of it as waiting after the first month. She thought of it now as just being in the middle of something that didn't have a visible end yet, something that required only that she keep moving until the shape of it became clear. Earl Calloway died on a Tuesday morning in March. The call came at 6:15. Lee was already awake, standing at the kitchen sink in her uniform shirt with her second cup of coffee going cold on the counter beside her. The number on her phone screen was one she recognized, a 304 area code, the VA Medical Center in Huntington. She answered before the second ring. The nurse who spoke to her had the particular gentleness of someone who had made this call before, many times before. She said Earl had passed quietly in his sleep sometime after midnight. No distress, she said. No sign of pain. He had been comfortable in his final weeks. She said it the way someone says words they believe are true and also knows are not enough. Lee thanked her and hung up and stood at the kitchen sink for a long time looking at the parking lot below. The sky was still gray. A truck idled at the far end of the lot with its headlights on. A man she didn't recognize got out, walked to a dumpster, threw something in and drove away. The lot was empty again. She didn't cry. She wasn't certain what she felt. There was something in her chest that was heavy and undefined, the way a bruise feels before the color comes up present, but not yet visible. She set the phone down on the counter next to the cold coffee and stood there in her uniform shirt while the sky outside went from gray to pale, and the laundromat below began its first cycle of the day, the building vibrating slow and low beneath her feet. Earl Calloway had been 71 years old. He had served in the military, came home, and spent the next 3 decades as a maintenance worker for the Dunmore County Parks Department. He mowed grass, repaired irrigation lines, repainted benches, cleared storm drains, replaced chain-link sections that went crooked in the winter frost. He retired at 62 with a modest pension and moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a building on Cutter Street in Grayson, 14 miles from the county park where he'd spent the better part of his working life. He drove a 2001 Chevy pickup with rust along the wheel wells and a crack in the dashboard that he'd covered with electrical tape. He did not take vacations. He did not go to restaurants unless someone insisted. He ate canned soup and grilled cheese sandwiches and scrambled eggs and seemed content with all of it in the way that people are content when they've made a private arrangement with simplicity that nobody else is privy to. On weekends, Earl went fishing. That was what he said when Lee called on Sunday mornings, which she did with the regularity of someone who knew the call was overdue and made it anyway as a kind of penance. He'd say he was just getting in from the lake a little tired, the fish weren't biting, but it was a nice morning to be out. She'd ask if he needed anything and he'd say no. They would talk for 5 minutes about nothing much. She'd hang up and feel vaguely that she had missed something without being able to identify what it was. She had loved her father. She had also spent most of her adult life with a low-grade frustration toward him that she never quite examined, because examining it would have required sitting still long enough to understand it, and sitting still was not something she had been good at. The frustration was not about what he had done. It was about what he hadn't. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't asked the hard questions. He hadn't shown up in the ways that she had needed him to show up. Not when her mother left when Lee was 11, not when she married Garrett, not when the marriage began to hollow out from the inside. He'd been present the way a wall is present, always there, providing a kind of structure, but silent and immovable in ways that sometimes felt indistinguishable from absence. She knew in the rational part of her brain that this was not entirely fair. But grief and fairness do not occupy the same space at the same time, and she had been grieving something about Earl Calloway long before the nurse called her on a Tuesday morning to say he was gone. The funeral was on Thursday. 5 people came. Lee, who stood at the front with Sadie's hand in hers. A woman from Earl's apartment building named Mrs. Croft, who was 74 and had brought a casserole dish covered in foil and said Earl had fixed her kitchen faucet last winter without being asked. She'd offered to pay him and he'd said no, he just noticed the drip through the wall and had the parts in his truck anyway. A pastor from a church Earl had attended a few times a year, a man who had clearly done his best with what little biographical information he had available to him. A man from the county parks department younger, with a sunburned neck, who said he'd started the job 6 years ago, and Earl had shown him which of the park's irrigation heads had been installed backward in 1994, and never corrected a detail the department's own records had failed to preserve. And a man from the Veterans Post in Grayson who introduced himself as Hal and said Earl had been a member for 20 years and was always the first to arrive to set up chairs for events and always gone by the time the event itself started. Quiet fellow, Hal said, but always there when it mattered. The service lasted 22 minutes. The pastor called Earl a man of few words and many deeds, which Lee thought was the most accurate thing anyone had said about her father in her memory. She stood holding Sadie's hand and listened and looked at the casket and tried to locate the thing that was sitting behind her ribs, the unformed weight of it, the thing that didn't have a name yet. Afterward in the parking lot, Mrs. Croft pressed the casserole into Lee's arms and looked at her with the direct steadiness of very old women who have run out of patience for pretending. She said your father was a good man who didn't know how to show it in the usual ways. Then she got in her car and drove away without waiting for a response, which was its own kind of gift. Lee put the casserole in the back seat. She drove home. She ate half of it standing at the kitchen counter and covered the rest with plastic wrap and stood in the middle of the apartment in the silence that the laundromat machines left between cycles and thought about her father being described by a woman who had known him for 3 years as a good man. And she thought about all the years she had known him and how rarely she had stopped to think of him in those terms. She felt something shift in the bottom of the unexamined place she kept behind her ribs. Not grief exactly, something more like the beginning of a question she hadn't known to ask. 3 days after the funeral, she drove to the VA in Huntington to collect his belongings. A nurse met her at the front desk. Her name badge said Patricia, and she had the kind of eyes that stay on your face when they're talking to you fully present, not glancing away. She led Lee down the corridor to a small room off the main ward and handed her a cardboard box that was not large. Not large at all. The whole of what her father had carried into this building fit in a box that Lee could carry with one arm. He was well liked on the ward, Patricia said. The staff here. He fixed the cabinet in the break room sometime last fall. The hinge had been broken for 2 years and nobody had gotten around to it. And one morning, Earl just showed up with a screwdriver and a piece of hardware and had it done before lunch. Nobody asked him to. That was just him. Lee looked at the box. That sounds exactly like him. He talked about you, Patricia said. Lee looked up from the box. Not often, Patricia said. He wasn't a man who talked much about personal things, but he kept a photograph on his nightstand. You and your daughter. And one time, maybe 2 years ago, he told me that his daughter was stronger than she knew. He seemed proud. Not the kind of proud that needs to say it, the quiet kind. Lee stood in the small room off the VA ward holding a cardboard box that contained the sum of what her father had carried into the world with him. And she did not know what to say to any of that, so she said thank you. And Patricia nodded and left her alone. She carried the box to the car. She sat behind the wheel in the parking lot with the box on the passenger seat and the engine off, looking at the hospital's brick facade. The morning was overcast, the light flat and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been photographed rather than seen. She sat there for a while, long enough for the lot to fill up around her and then begin to empty again. Then she started the engine and drove home. That night after her shift at the fulfillment center, she came home at 2:30 in the morning and sat down on the floor of the apartment with the box between her knees. The laundromat below had gone quiet, which it did only between 2 and 5, and the silence was so complete that she could hear the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic from the highway 3 blocks east, and the particular sound of her own breathing in a room that was otherwise still. She pulled out his reading glasses first. Wire frames, one arm attached with a loop of electrical tape. The lenses scratched at the edges in the pattern of glasses worn by someone who sets them down on their lenses without thinking. She set them on the carpet beside her. His flannel shirt came next. Green and brown plaid, the fabric softened from years of washing until it felt like something between cloth and paper, the way old flannel gets when it's been loved through enough seasons. She held it against her face and breathed in. It smelled like grass clippings and bar soap and something faintly sweet that she had been aware of her whole life without ever naming. She held it there for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep, and set it on the floor beside the glasses. The pocket watch was brass old with his initials engraved on the back, along with 2 words she had to tilt toward the lamp to read Semper Fi. The crystal was cracked a single diagonal line running from 10 o'clock to 4. The hands had stopped at 4:17. She turned it over in her palm and felt the weight of it, more weight than something that small should have, and she set it down carefully beside the flannel shirt. Then she lifted the Bible out of the box. It was old, the leather cover dried and cracked along the spine, the binding held together by a rubber band that had gone brittle with age, the kind of brittleness that means it will break the next time it's moved. She slipped the rubber band off carefully, and it snapped anyway, dropping to the carpet in two pieces. She opened the cover. The pages were thin as onion skin, some of them dog-eared, some marked with a pencil line in the margin. Her father had underlined passages throughout and written small annotations in his careful slanted print, the same handwriting she had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists her whole life. She turned through several pages slowly. He had marked more than she would have expected. There were passages in the Psalms, passages in the Gospels, a section in Job where he had simply written yes in the margin beside a verse she read 3 times and still couldn't parse in the way he had clearly parsed it. She ran her thumb along the spine. It felt wrong. Not the texture of the cover, not the pages, the spine itself. She pressed her fingers along it and felt a ridge, something flat and stiff beneath the leather between the outer binding and the inner layer. Something that shouldn't be there. She pressed harder and felt the edges of it, rectangular, slightly thicker on one end than the other, the distinct geometry of a folded document. She turned the Bible over and examined the back cover in the lamplight. The inner edge of the spine where the binding met the back panel had been opened. She could see it when she looked closely enough. The original thread had been cut and replaced with new thread of a slightly different color, a few degrees lighter. Something that would be invisible to anyone not looking for it. Someone had cut the Bible's binding open, placed something inside, and sewn it back together. The work was careful, deliberate, unhurried. The stitches were even and tight. This was not a rushed decision. This was a man who had thought about where to put something and then put it there with the same care he brought to everything else he did with his hands. Lee sat on the floor of the apartment with the Bible in her lap and looked at that seam of thread for a long time. Then she got up and went to the kitchen drawer where she kept scissors and a handful of things that didn't have another home. Rubber bands, a spare key, 2 dead batteries she kept meaning to throw away. She came back with the scissors and sat down and cut the stitching slowly, one thread at a time, working along the seam without tearing the leather. The binding separated. She eased the flap apart with both thumbs. Inside, pressed flat and folded twice, was a single piece of paper. She pulled it out. She unfolded it. She held it under the lamp. It was a property deed, filed with the Dunmore County Recorder's Office. Property of Earl Raymond Calloway. 53 acres in the unincorporated territory of Dunmore County, West Virginia, parcel number, and legal description filling the center of the page in the compact impersonal font of official documents. Recorded October 9th, 1988. Purchase price $1,800. She read it once. She turned it over. The back was blank. She read it again. She set it on the carpet and looked at the Bible, and then looked at the deed and felt the floor shift beneath everything she thought she knew about her father. Earl Calloway, the Parks Department groundskeeper. The man who drove a truck held together with rust and stubbornness. The man who ate scrambled eggs for dinner 4 nights out of 7 and had never once, not once in her memory, spent money on something that wasn't necessary. He had owned 53 acres of land for 36 years. He had owned it since she was 2 years old, and he had told no one. She didn't sleep that night. At 5 in the morning, she was at the kitchen counter with her laptop open, searching the Dunmore County Assessor's website. The parcel came up immediately. Earl R. Calloway, owner. Taxes current through the previous tax year, paid from a P.O. box in a small town called Draper, about 90 miles south of Beckley. The assessed value was low rural designation, no municipal utilities, no road frontage on the county's maintained network. But there was a line in the record she read twice and then a third time. Improvements on parcel. She called the county assessor's office when it opened at 8:30. The woman who answered was matter-of-fact and efficient. She confirmed the parcel was active taxes, current, no liens or encumbrances on record. When Lee asked about the improvements notation, the woman said the record indicated structures of some kind, but she didn't have detail on the nature or condition. You'd need to go out there yourself to see what she said. The address on file is a rural route, no street-level data. Lee thanked her and hung up. She looked at the deed on the counter. She looked at her coffee, which was already cold. She had a shift at the diner in 40 minutes. She put on her uniform shirt and drove to work and poured coffee and ran plates and wiped down booths, and the deed was in the front pocket of her apron where she could feel its folded edge against her hip every time she turned. She felt it all morning the way you feel a splinter you can't get out, present, insistent, demanding attention even when your hands are doing something else entirely. That night she packed boxes at the fulfillment center and thought about 53 acres. She thought about what improvements might mean on a parcel that a groundskeeper had been paying taxes on for 36 years from a P.O. box in a town she'd never heard of. She thought about the Sunday morning calls. She thought about the word quiet and how many different things it could mean and how she had only ever assumed it meant one thing. She called in sick to the fulfillment center on Thursday for the first time in 9 months. She didn't feel guilty about it. She felt awake in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, a specific kind of alertness that comes not from rest, but from a question you can't stop turning over, a question that has weight and shape and demands to be answered. She spent Thursday pulling up satellite maps, county road records, anything she could find on the parcel number. The satellite image was low resolution and mostly showed tree cover, a dense canopy that revealed nothing of what was beneath it. The county road records showed an unimproved private drive off County Road 7, just past a gap in a fence line. No mailbox listed, no name on the drive, just coordinates and a parcel number and the name of a man who went fishing on weekends. Sadie was at Garrett's until Friday evening. Friday morning, Lee packed the car. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She put the deed in her jacket pocket and filled a thermos with coffee and drove south on the highway, then east on a state road, then onto a county road that narrowed as it went, the asphalt cracking and heaving from years of freeze-thaw cycles and deferred maintenance. The trees pressing closer on both sides until the road felt less like a road and more like a corridor someone had cut through the forest and then forgotten about. She drove slowly, watching for landmarks. A fence line on the right side, a gap in the fence. The county assessor's description said a metal gate, rural Route 7, approximately 2.4 miles east of the intersection with State Road 41. She saw the gate before she reached the mileage mark. It was set into the fence line rusted iron pipe construction, the kind of gate that had been hanging in the same place long enough that the posts on either side had grown slightly around the hinge hardware. No padlock, no mailbox, no name. Just the gate, and beyond it a dirt track that curved between old oaks and disappeared into the shade. Lee pulled off onto the shoulder and turned off the engine. She sat there for a moment. The road was empty in both directions. The trees on either side held their spring green quietly in the morning air. She could hear birds somewhere in the canopy above. A woodpecker working somewhere in the distance, methodical, unhurried, the sound of a creature that knows exactly what it's doing and sees no reason to hurry about it. She got out of the car, walked to the gate, lifted the latch and pushed it open. The hinges held without complaint. Someone had oiled them recently enough that they moved without resistance. She noticed this. She got back in the car and drove through. The track curved between the oaks for a quarter mile or so. The canopy was thick enough to drop the temperature by several degrees and dim the mid-morning light to something green and diffused. Gravel popped under her tires. She drove slowly. Then the trees opened. She stopped the car and sat there with the engine running. The clearing was larger than she'd expected. A house stood at the far side of it, single-story wood-sided, with a covered porch that ran the width of the front face. The roof was metal, painted dark green, gone lighter in places where the seasons had worked on it. The wood siding had been stained, not painted, and the stain had held well, the grain of the wood still visible beneath it. The windows were framed in dark trim. A stone path led from the yard to the porch steps. To the right of the house, set back about 40 feet, was a larger structure, a workshop or a barn. Wide double doors painted the same dark green as the house roof, both doors closed. A small window high on the side wall. To the left, a garden area with raised beds framed in rough-cut lumber, the soil dark and turned. Trellises at intervals, bare still but standing straight. A small structure at the far edge of the garden that she recognized from a shape she'd seen in photographs. As a chicken coop empty now, its door standing open. And three white-painted boxes on a low platform near the eastern tree line. Beehives. Behind all of it, stretching back toward the low hills on the property's south edge, rows of trees stood in careful, even lines. Dozens of them spaced deliberately, the spacing too regular to be anything but intentional. Apple trees, she realized. An orchard. The trees were in early bloom, white flowers scattered along the upper branches, the blossoms bright against the gray-green sky. Everything was still. There was no sound from the road, no traffic, no other structure visible in any direction. Just the house and the workshop and the orchard and the garden, and the particular silence of a place that has been tended carefully by one person for a very long time and carries that tending in its bones. Lee turned off the engine. She opened her door and stepped out onto the grass. The air smelled different here than it had on the road. Damp soil and something green and living, and beneath that faint and sweet the smell of apple blossoms, the particular sweetness of a tree that is doing exactly what it was planted to do. She stood beside the car and looked at the house and the orchard and the beehives in the workshop and tried to make the math of it work in her mind. Her father, Earl Calloway, groundskeeper, retired, pension-broken truck, canned soup. These structures, these rows of trees, this silence. She walked to the house. The porch steps were solid under her foot. No flex, no creak, each step level and true. The porch boards were clean swept at some point recently enough that the winter's accumulated debris hadn't reclaimed them. The railing along the front of the porch was smooth under her palms, sanded fine, and sealed, the seal still intact even under the thin film of dust that settled on everything in a closed place over months of no one coming. She ran her hand along it slowly. This was not weekend work done in a hurry. This was not a man who came out a few times a year and did what needed doing. Every inch of this railing told her someone had stood here with sandpaper and worked through the grits coarse to fine until the wood was as smooth as it was going to get, and then sealed it to stay that way. The front door was unlocked. She turned the knob and pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, the specific stillness of a space that has been closed for some time, but not abandoned. Not the staleness of a place left to decay, but the composed quiet of a place held in readiness. A thin layer of dust covered every surface, but the dust sat on order. The main room had a wood stove against the far wall, a single armchair positioned to face it, and floor-to-ceiling shelves built into the walls on either side of the stove. The shelves were empty, but they had been built expecting to be filled. The proportions were specific. These were shelves designed for books, for jars, for the particular inventory of a life. The kitchen was small, a cast-iron sink, a two-burner propane stove, a counter made from a single wide plank of wood, sanded and sealed until it had a depth to it, even under the dust, the grain of the wood visible in the finish like something preserved in amber. Above the counter, two windows that looked out toward the orchard. A bedroom through a doorway on the left. A bed frame built from the same wood as the shelves. A mattress still sealed in its factory plastic, never slept on. A nightstand with a single drawer. A window facing east toward the orchard, positioned lower than she might have expected, as though someone had calculated exactly what you would see from a lying down position and built the window to frame it. She moved through each room slowly and looked at everything. The ceiling was low and even the planks fitted without gaps. The floors were solid, not a single soft spot under her weight anywhere she stepped. The joins at the corners of the rooms were tight, the work of someone who measured carefully and had enough patience to pull out what wasn't right and start the piece again, rather than accept something that was close but not correct. Everything in the house had been built by the same hands. She could see it in the proportions, in the way the details repeated across every room, in the slight imperfections that weren't flaws but signatures. The way a craftsman's work is always recognizable once you know what you're looking for. This was not a contractor's build. This was one person with hand tools and time, and a standard that existed entirely inside his own head, building toward that standard season by season, year by year, decade by decade. She was standing in the kitchen looking at the counter when she saw the table. Square four legs built from the same wood as the counter, one chair pushed in beneath it, and on the table placed in the center with deliberate care, a white envelope. Her name was written on the front. Pencil. Small, careful letters slanting slightly to the right. Lee. His handwriting. She would have known it anywhere, in any light, on any surface. She crossed the room and picked up the envelope. Through the paper, she could feel something solid. A key. She held the envelope and looked at her name on the front and felt the world slow down to the speed of the moment, to the particular pace at which things that matter actually happen, which is slower than everything else. She slid her thumb under the sealed flap and opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper wrapped around a brass key. She set the key on the table and unfolded the paper. Earl's handwriting, the same careful print she'd known her whole life. Lee, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found what I hid. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I tried to start that conversation 100 times and never got past the first sentence. This property is yours. Everything I built here is for you and for Sadie. The key opens the workshop. Start there. There are other letters around the place. You'll find them when you're ready. I numbered them so you'd know the order. This one doesn't have a number because it's not part of the set. It's just me saying that I'm sorry I was the kind of father who built things instead of saying things. I hope what I built is enough. Dad. She read it once. She folded it and held it in both hands and looked out the kitchen window at the rows of apple trees in early bloom, white against the pale sky. She stood there for a long time without moving. The orchard was still. The blossoms on the upper branches moved slightly in a wind she couldn't feel from inside the house. Then she looked at the key on the table. Brass, old, round head, simple cut. She picked it up. She walked off the porch and across the yard to the workshop. The double doors had a padlock on a hasp. She fit the key into the padlock. It turned on the first try, the mechanism clean and smooth, oiled as recently as the gate hinges. She pulled the lock free and slid the hasp open and pushed both doors back on their hinges. The morning light poured in. The workshop was larger than it looked from outside. 30 feet deep, 20 wide. A workbench ran the full length of the back wall, tools organized above it on a pegboard system that must have taken a full day to lay out. Handsaws, planes, chisels, clamps, level squares, marking gauges, spokes, halves, a brace, and bits. A set of card scrapers, all of them hanging in their own designated space. All of them clean beneath the fine layer of dust that settles on everything in a closed space over time. But the tools were not what stopped her in the doorway. The floor of the workshop was full of furniture. Not stacked, not stored carelessly or pushed against walls to save space. Set out with space between each piece, as though they were in a room that hadn't been built yet, as though someone had already decided exactly where each piece would go and had arranged them accordingly. A long dining table, clean lines, tapered legs, the surface smooth and even, stained the color of dark honey. 2 benches to match it. A bookshelf tall and wide with adjustable shelves on wooden pegs. The wood finished to the same standard as everything in the house. A rocking chair smaller than the others, child-sized, curved and proportional, and balanced on its runners with the easy precision of something that had been rocked and adjusted and rocked again until it was exactly right, until it moved the way a rocking chair should move, without effort, without thinking about it. A dresser, 6 drawers, brass, pulls the grain of the wood running straight and even across every face. A side table with a single shelf below. A set of coat hooks mounted on a backing board. A cutting board so thick it felt more like a workbench than a kitchen tool. Every piece was finished. Every piece was sealed and smooth and ready to be used. And every piece had a strip of masking tape on it with Earl's handwriting. She walked into the workshop slowly, the way you walk into a room you're afraid to disturb. afraid that too much noise or too much movement will collapse the thing that's holding it. She touched the dining table. The masking tape read Lee's kitchen. She moved to the bookshelf. The tape read main room east wall. The rocking chair for Sadie. She stood in front of the dresser and read the tape Lee's bedroom. She went from piece to piece and read each label in her father's handwriting and felt the ground continue to move beneath everything she thought she understood. He had built this furniture for rooms he had built in a house she had never known existed. He had labeled each piece for a space he'd imagined for her. Not someday vaguely, specifically, with measurements and placement and her name written on masking tape and pencil in the same handwriting that had written her name on birthday cards for 38 years. She stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by 36 years of weekend work, and put her hand flat on the surface of the dining table and felt the wood under her palm, the grain, the smoothness, the solidity of it. And she stood there and breathed in the smell of sawdust and linseed oil and dry air and the particular smell of a space where a man had done the work he understood best. And somewhere in the back of her throat, something tightened into a shape that didn't have a name. She had thought her father was fishing. She had called on Sunday mornings and he'd said he was just getting back from the lake. A little tired. Fish weren't biting, but it was a nice morning to be out. And she had accepted it the way you accept the things people tell you when you are not paying close enough attention. She had said, "Good, glad you got out," and she had moved the conversation along to safer ground and hung up after 5 minutes and gone about her day. 36 years of Sunday mornings. 36 years of her father driving 2 hours south to this clearing in the woods to pour concrete and frame walls and plant apple trees and build furniture for a daughter who didn't know she was going to need it. She was still standing with her hand on the table when she heard gravel on the drive outside. An engine. Not the rumble of a truck in the way new trucks rumble, but something older. A mechanical rhythm she recognized as belonging to a vehicle that had been maintained rather than replaced, that had been kept going out of relationship rather than convenience. She stepped to the doorway of the workshop. A blue pickup, old and clean, was coming up the dirt track through the oaks. A border collie with black and white markings that she'd noticed at the edge of the orchard when she first drove in, had moved to the far side of the yard and sat down upright, ears forward, watching the truck with recognition rather than alarm. The truck stopped. The engine went quiet. The door opened. The man who got out was tall, lean, white-haired under a feed store cap. He moved with the deliberate steadiness of a man in his late 70s who had been strong for a long time and had made his peace with the body's negotiations. He wore a work shirt, faded dark green, and boots that had seen decades of real use. He looked at Lee standing in the workshop doorway, and he stopped and he took off his cap and he held it in both hands. He looked at her for a long moment, not the look of a stranger assessing another stranger. Something else. The look of a man who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just without warning been given the answer. "Lee," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She stepped down from the workshop. "I'm Lee Calloway, Earl's daughter." The man nodded slowly. He put his cap back on. "Walt Pruitt. I live up the road about a quarter mile. I've been keeping an eye on the place since Earl went into the VA. You knew him." 30 years of Saturday morning coffee, Walt said. "Yes, I did." She looked at this man who had spent 30 years having coffee with her father on Saturday mornings, a man she had never heard named, and she thought about all the Saturday mornings she had not thought to call. She thought about all the things that had been happening here on this land, in this clearing, while she was living her life somewhere else and assuming she knew the shape of her father's. "He came here every weekend," Walt said. "Everyone I can remember. He'd pull in Friday night or early Saturday. We'd have coffee on my porch around 8. Then he'd work all day Saturday and most of Sunday, whatever needed doing that week. Planting, building, repairing. He drove home Sunday evening. He didn't miss not for 30 years, give or take a few." Lee looked at the house, then at the orchard, then back at Walt. "He told me he went fishing," she said. Walt looked at her steadily. He wasn't a man who said things without weighing them first. "I know. He said that to a lot of people." Why didn't he tell me Walt was quiet for a moment? He looked at the house the way a man looks at something he's watched be built piece by piece over 3 decades with a particular kind of familiarity that comes from witnessing something grow. Then he looked back at Lee. That he said is something the letters might answer better than I can. He told me there were letters, said he'd hidden them around the place, said she'll find them when she's ready. He looked at her. I figured it was you he meant. Lee held the key in her closed fist and looked at the man who had been her father's closest companion for 30 years, a man she had never heard named, and she felt the weight of everything she hadn't known settle over her. Not like a burden, but like a landscape, something vast and intricate, that she was only now beginning to understand she was standing inside. Walt put his hands in his pockets and looked at the orchard. She can come back to life, he said. Orchard's been without close attention for about a year and a half. Bees are still going. I've been checking the hives best I can. The house is solid. Earl built everything to last. I know, Lee said. I can see that. Walt nodded once. You want me to show you around the property? She looked at the house at the workshop, with its full inventory of furniture built and labeled, and waiting at the rows of apple trees stretching back toward the low hills at the beehives on their platform, at the dogs still sitting at the edge of the yard, watching all of it with calm, steady eyes. Yeah, she said, show me everything. Walt walked her through the property the way someone walks through a place they have memorized not by intention, but by presence, by being there repeatedly over time until the geography of it becomes part of your own internal landscape. He knew every corner of Callaway Ridge the way Lee suspected her father had known it, not as a collection of features, but as a living thing, with its own character and history and seasonal moods. The orchard first. 83 trees, Walt said, moving along the first row with his hands at his sides. Earl planted 3 or 4 a year, starting in 1990. The oldest ones were substantial now, their trunks thickened by decades of growth, the bark furrowed and gray and marked with the slow, patient writing of time. Walt moved between them with the ease of someone who had walked this ground hundreds of times, pointing out varieties as he went. Wine saps along the south row, he said. Arkansas blacks on the west side. Those are your late-season keepers, hold their flavor well into winter. Newtown pippins in the center section. And these, he said, stopping at a group of trees near the eastern boundary, these are grafted stock. Earl did the grafting himself. Lee looked at the trees. They were younger than the others, their form different in some way she couldn't immediately name. Walt picked up a fallen branch from the ground, turned it in his hands, set it down. He checked out a book from the county library. Grafting technique apple varieties suited to this elevation. He practiced on scrap wood for a while before he did it for real. First few grafts didn't take. He kept at it. By the 3rd year, he was grafting 2 or 3 a season. He combined rootstock from the hardier trees with scion wood from varieties he wanted to introduce. He said you could take the best qualities of 2 different trees and put them together if you were patient enough. He said that. He told me once Walt said that patience wasn't about waiting. It was about working while you waited. Lee walked between the trees. The blossoms were past peak, but still present white petals on the grass below the branches holding the last of the spring flowers. The ground underneath was soft from recent rain, and she could smell the earth and the bark, and the sweetness of the blossoms mixed together into something that was one smell, not 3. She ran her hand along the trunk of one of the older trees. The bark was rough and deeply channeled. It had been growing in this exact spot since she was in elementary school. The beehives were next. 3 colonies on a low wooden platform, the hive bodies painted white, the paint weathered to a matte finish. Walt had been checking them since Earl went into the VA, he said. He wasn't a beekeeper, didn't pretend to be, but he'd watched Earl work the hives enough times to know the basics. Check the frames, make sure they have stores, watch for signs of trouble in the behavior of the returning bees. Earl could sit next to a hive, Walt said, and the bees never bothered him. He'd take the lid off and look at the frames with no smoke, no veil. Just sat there with them like they had an arrangement. Like he'd introduced himself early on and they'd come to an understanding. Behind the workshop, a path led down a gentle slope to the root cellar. Walt pulled open the wooden door, which was thick and set into the hillside, and they stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the air cool and dark and smelling of earth and vinegar and the particular mustiness of preserved things in glass. Shelves lined both walls, floor to ceiling, and every shelf was full. Mason jars in rows. Apple butter peach preserves, pickled green beans, canned tomatoes, blackberry jam, bread and butter pickles. Dried herbs in paper bags, each one labeled in Earl's handwriting. Rosemary, thyme, sage, dried apple slices in sealed jars. Honey in amber jars, the labels reading only the year. The most recent jars were dated 2 years prior. The last summer Earl had been well enough to put in a full season of preserving. He spent September and October putting things up, Walt said. Every year. Said the root cellar was the heart of the place. You could be without a lot of things, he said, but you couldn't be without food in the ground. Lee moved along the shelves, reading the labels in her father's handwriting. The same print she'd seen on birthday cards, on the masking tape in the workshop. He had written each label the same way, small and careful, the letters, even the numbers clear. She picked up a jar of peach preserves and held it to the light that came through the open door. The contents were a deep gold, still sealed, the lid firm under her thumb. Walt led her to the spring last. Behind the orchard, past the eastern tree line, a narrow trail through a stand of birch trees, the bark white and papery, the new leaves bright lime green against the gray sky. The trail ended at a rock face where water seeped from a crack in the stone and collected in a shallow basin before running off downhill in a thin, clear line. Earl had the water tested every couple of years, Walt said. Never failed. He ran a gravity line from the basin to the house. PVC pipe buried below frost depth with a slow drop all the way. Simple system. Doesn't need power. Just gravity and clean water doing what they naturally do. The water moved over the stone with a sound that was barely a sound, more of a presence than a noise, the kind of thing you feel as much as hear. Lee crouched down and put her fingers in the basin. The cold of it moved up through her hand and into her wrist. Walt, she said without looking up. Did he ever tell you who he was building this for? Walt was quiet long enough that she looked up at him. He was standing with his cap in his hands, turning it slowly. He looked at the spring. Once, he said, we were sitting on my porch. This was maybe 12 years ago. He'd just finished the floors in the bedroom, spent most of the summer getting them right. He was tired that evening, tired the way a man gets when he's done something that cost him, but he looked satisfied in the way I'd come to recognize, like a man who has done the thing he set out to do exactly as he meant to do it. And he said, I'm building something for someone who doesn't know she needs it yet. That's all. I didn't ask who, figured he'd tell me when he was ready. He looked at Lee. I guess he told you instead, he said. She stood up from the basin and dried her hand on her jeans. She looked at the birch trees and the orchard beyond them, and thought about her father sitting on a neighbor's porch 12 years ago, tired from finishing a bedroom floor, saying those words to a man who had the good sense to simply receive them and not push for more. The kind of friend who understood that some things are only said because the saying is enough, not because an answer is required. They walked back to the workshop. The dog had moved while they were in the root cellar, repositioned to the edge of the yard, still watching. Walt gave Lee his phone number on a scrap of paper from his shirt pocket. Anything you need, he said. I'm a quarter mile up the road. Don't hesitate. He tipped his cap and got in his truck and drove back down the track through the oaks. Lee watched the truck disappear into the trees. Then she turned and went back into the workshop. She stood in the center of it for a while, surrounded by furniture her father had built and labeled and stored against a future he had imagined for her. She moved to the workbench along the back wall and began opening the drawers one at a time. The first held hardware, nails and screws sorted into coffee cans by size and type, each can labeled in his handwriting. The second held sandpaper in multiple grits, stacked in order from rough to fine, the way you stack things when you want whoever comes after you to be able to find what they need without having to think about it. The third held measuring tools, a combination square, a marking gauge, a small level. The fourth was shallow, just an inch of depth, and held only pencils, worn down to various lengths in a small sharpener. She opened the fifth drawer. Inside was an envelope. White small, the number 2 written on the front in pencil. She sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the workbench and opened it. The letter was 2 pages, Earl's handwriting, small and careful, filling both sides of each sheet. He began with the tools. The wood planes need oiling twice a year, he wrote. Linseed oil, only the can, is under the bench on the left side. Not the tung oil that's for finishing. The chisels are sharp, keep them sharp. A dull chisel is more dangerous than a sharp one. Don't use them without the gloves in the top drawer. The handsaw on the right peg is the good one. The one beside it pulls left. I've been meaning to retension the blade for a year. Probably won't get to it now. The joiner plane is the one I'm proudest of. 40 years old. I got it at an estate sale for $8. It just needed a new iron and a good flattening. Everything it needed was already there. It just needed someone to pay attention to it. She read through the tool notes slowly. He wrote about each one the way someone writes about a thing they love, which is to say practically with specific detail and no sentiment, because sentiment would have felt like showing off. The love was in the detail. It was always in the detail with Earl Calloway. Then at the bottom of the first page, his handwriting changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just a degree smaller, the letters pressed a little more firmly into the paper. Now, the part I really want to say, he wrote it that way as a transition, as if the tool notes had been the warm-up, and this was what he'd actually sat down to write the thing the tool notes were making space for. You were the strongest person I knew. Even when you were 11 years old and stood at the kitchen window when your mother drove away and didn't make a sound. I stood behind you, and I wanted to say it's all right to cry. It's all right to fall apart. But the words didn't come. They never did, the ones that mattered. I've thought about that moment your whole life. I've thought about what I should have said and didn't. And I've thought about all the moments after it when I had another chance and let it pass. I built things instead. I know that's not the same. I know a kitchen table is not the same as saying, I see you and I'm here. But it's what I had to give. It was the only language I ever learned for what I meant. I hope someday you'll understand that they were the same thing, the words in the wood. I hope you'll know they came from the same place. Dad. Lee sat on the concrete floor of the workshop and read the letter twice. Outside, the light was shifting, the afternoon coming on the shadows from the oak canopy moving across the yard. She could see through the open workshop doors to the orchard, the rows of trees, the blossoms on the upper branches, moving slightly in a wind that reached them, but not her. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket with the first one. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Then she got up, brushed the dust from her jeans, and went to find where the orchard began. The first weekend, she brought cleaning supplies, mops and rags and Murphy oil soap, and 3 kinds of scrub brushes, and 4 trash bags, and a broom with a handle long enough to reach the ceiling corners where the winter had left its silk and dust. She worked through the house room by room, and Sadie worked alongside her because that was the kind of child. Sadie was not the kind who needed to be asked twice or kept entertained, but the kind who understood at 9 years old that work was a way of being present with someone you cared about. They swept and scrubbed and carried Earl's furniture in from the workshop piece by piece. The rocking chair came in first, Sadie insisting on it, carrying it across the yard herself, with the careful grip of someone transporting something irreplaceable. She set it by the front window in the main room and sat down in it and rocked it twice, testing. "It's perfect," Sadie said. She looked up at Lee with an expression that was wonder and something else, something Lee recognized as grief, quiet and personal. The grief of a child who understands loss, but not yet its full dimensions. "He made this for me, and he never even knew me very much." "He met you when you were a baby," Lee said. "You wouldn't remember." "But he remembered," Sadie said. Together they wrestled the dining table through the front door and set it in the kitchen. The masking tape label was still on it. Lee peeled it off carefully and held it for a moment before folding it and putting it in her pocket. She ran her hand across the surface. The wood was warm under her palm, the grain visible in the sanded finish, the table solid and level and exactly the right size for the room. as though whoever had measured the kitchen had measured it with this table already in mind. Because they had. The dog watched all of this from varying distances, never coming onto the porch, never approaching the open door. He had accepted their presence in the yard at a range of about 20 feet, and he enforced this boundary with no sound and no aggression, only the steady watch of a pair of dark eyes tracking their movements. He was not aggressive. He was careful. There was a difference. Sadie did not rush him. She seemed to understand instinctively that the dog's threshold was a thing to be respected, not a challenge to be overcome. She would sit on the porch steps when they stopped to rest, and she would look at the dog at his 20-foot remove, and she would say nothing. After a while, she began talking to him quietly, not trying to call him over, not using any particular dog-calling voice, just talking the way you talk to someone you're not trying to convince of anything. She told him about her library book, a thick one about a girl who solved mysteries by paying attention to things others overlooked. She told him that his coloring made him look like a map of somewhere she'd like to go. On the third weekend, Sadie named him. She was sitting on the porch steps after lunch when she put her library book down and looked at the dog at his customary distance and said, "I want to call him Birch, like the trees by the spring." Lee considered it. "He's guarding the place like he owns it." "He does own it a little," Sadie said. "He was here first." Birch, Lee said, trying it. The dog raised his eyes but not his head. His ears shifted slightly. Sadie grinned. "I think he likes it." After that, the dog was Birch, and after that he began slowly and on his own terms to close the distance. Walt stopped by most Saturdays. He had the quality of presence that some older men have the ability to be in a place without requiring it to accommodate him. He'd sit in the other porch chair and talk about the property the way someone talks about a thing they've watched grow up with affection and specificity and the unhurried willingness of a man who has nowhere more important to be. He told Lee which fence post Earl had set first, still standing at the northwest corner of the property, the wood darkened with decades of weather but solid as the day it was sunk. He showed her the stone path to the root cellar and explained that Earl had carried each flat stone from a creek bed half a mile into the property because the drainage profile was wrong everywhere closer. That he'd made that walk dozens of times with stones balanced in a wheelbarrow because the path needed to be right. He pointed out the mark Earl had carved into the doorframe of the workshop, a small E with the year 1990. "First year," Walt said. "Earl put that there at the end of the first working season. Said he wanted the building to know when it started." She asked Walt one Saturday what her father had been like, the way you ask someone who knew a person better than you did, which is an admission that takes a certain kind of honesty to make. Walt thought about it the way he thought about most things, from the bottom up rather than the top down. "Patient," he said finally. He was the most patient man I ever knew. Not slow, he could move fast when something needed it. But he never let urgency make his decisions for him. If something wasn't right, he took it apart and started over. Never got angry about it. Never complained that the work was hard or that the weather was bad or that something hadn't turned out the way he planned. He just corrected it and kept going. I never once saw him quit on anything. "Did he talk about me not by name?" Walt said. "But he'd mention his daughter. He'd say things like, 'My girl's sharp.' Or he'd come back from one of your visits and be quiet the rest of the weekend, quieter than usual, and I'd know something hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. But I didn't ask. He'd tell me when he wanted to. Usually he didn't want to." Lee looked at her hands. "I wasn't easy to be close to at the end," she said. "I was wrapped up in my own situation for a long time. I barely called." Walt looked at the orchard. He understood more than he showed he said. That was just his way. He figured people were doing what they could. He never held a debt over anyone. Walt set his cup down on the railing then and looked at the orchard for a long time before he spoke again. "There's something I should tell you," he said. "About 10 years ago." Lee looked at him. "Earl came down here one Friday evening in the fall, and he didn't look right. Not sick exactly, like a man who'd gotten news and was deciding what to do with it. I asked him. He was quiet for a while, the way he was quiet when he was thinking something through. Then he told me. He'd been to a doctor in Beckley. They'd found something. Prostate cancer. Stage 2. The doctor gave him a range, 3 to 5 years if he didn't pursue aggressive treatment. Walt paused. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He didn't pursue it, Walt said. He chose a minimal approach, managed it with medication and monitoring, nothing more. I asked him why. He said he couldn't go into the hospital for a long surgery and a long recovery, not then. I pushed him on it. I told him that was not a reasonable decision. He looked at me the way he looked at things he'd already decided, steady and final, no room for argument. And he said, Walt, I'm not finished yet. I asked him what he meant. He said, I haven't written all the letters. There are things I haven't put down yet. I can't go until I'm finished. Walt was quiet for a moment. He lived 10 more years after that diagnosis, he said. He finished the house. He planted the last of the grafted trees. He put up every jar in that root cellar. He built every piece of furniture in that workshop, and he labeled every one. He wrote whatever he needed to write and hid it where he hid it. And then he drove to the VA and he checked in and he didn't come back here. I think he knew that if he came back even once, he wouldn't be able to leave. He needed to be finished before he let himself stop. That was just his way. Lee sat with what Walt had told her. She sat with the image of her father receiving a diagnosis in a doctor's office in Beckley and driving 2 hours south to this property and going to work. Not calling her, not calling anyone, just going to work. She understood it. She did not like that she understood it, but she understood it completely. She found the third letter on the fifth weekend. She had been following Walt's instructions about the root cellar, rotating the jar stock, moving the older inventory to the front of each shelf and the newer jars behind. She moved a row of canned tomatoes on the lowest shelf and felt something behind them. A white envelope, dusty, the number 3 on the front. She wiped it off and opened it, standing in the cool dark of the cellar with a jar of tomatoes in her other hand. Earl wrote about the preserves: first, which shelf to eat from; first, which jars had held best; which batch of apple butter from 2 years prior was better than any he'd ever made, and she should eat it on good bread and nothing else. Then now the part you won't want to hear. She read the rest of the letter standing very still in the root cellar, with the afternoon light falling through the open door across the stone threshold. He wrote that he knew about Garrett, had known for a while. He wrote about Sadie's 6th birthday party 3 years prior, and a moment he had witnessed that Lee had assumed went unnoticed by everyone except her. Garrett had corrected her in front of his family, a small thing, a casual correction about a detail that didn't matter, delivered in the tone that makes a person feel slightly stupid for not having known better. Lee had gone quiet after. The kind of quiet that has a particular shape to it when you've been doing it for long enough, a deliberate practice quieting of yourself, the kind of silence you learn rather than fall into. Earl wrote, I recognized it, not because I'm wise, because I saw the same look on your mother's face for 2 years before she left. Only the direction was reversed. Your mother was the one who quieted me. You were being quieted. I knew what it meant. I knew where it went. He wrote that he had not said anything. He wrote about why. He had rehearsed the conversation in his truck on the drive home that night and on every Sunday drive home from the property for the following month. He had a version of it worked out that he thought was careful and honest without being an accusation. And every time he came close to making the call, he stopped. Because he knew his daughter. Because he knew that she was still in the middle of trying to make it work. And if he pushed, she would push back, and the pushing would move her further from him rather than closer. And then he would have less access, not more, and less access was the opposite of useful. So I kept building, he wrote. That's all I knew to do. I couldn't fight what was happening to you the way a person fights a person. I couldn't say the right words. But I could make sure that when you were ready, there was somewhere to come. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. I'm sorry I chose quiet when I should have chosen loud. But I want you to know I saw you. I always saw you. Lee sat down on the stone step of the root cellar, with the door open and the jar of tomatoes on the ground beside her, and read the letter a second time and then a third. The afternoon light moved across the threshold while she read. She felt the anger first. The clean, clear anger at a man who had seen something and said nothing, who had been close enough, who had known enough, and had chosen a different kind of action, who had built furniture and planted trees and preserved fruit instead of picking up the phone and saying what needed to be said. Then she sat with the anger for a while and let it be what it was. And underneath it, she found the other thing, the thing that was harder to hold. He was right. She would not have listened. She knew that with the particular clarity of hindsight, knew it in her body, the way you know the things about yourself that took suffering to learn. 3 years ago, she was still at the explaining away stage, still translating Garrett's behavior into something that could be managed, still believing that the problem was fixable if she just found the right approach. If Earl had called her, she would have defended Garrett. She would have said he was under stress. She would have said that Earl didn't understand the full picture. And she would have hung up the phone and felt her way further into the isolation that had been quietly closing around her for years. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket with the others. She climbed out of the root cellar and walked to the porch and sat down in the chair that faced the orchard. The dog was at the edge of the yard. Sadie was in the trees beyond him, talking to herself the way she did when she was thinking through something complicated. The dog was watching her with his full attention. He hadn't moved closer, but his posture had changed. He was no longer guarding. He was simply interested. She watched her daughter in the orchard and thought about her father watching her at Sadie's birthday party. Seeing everything, driving home that night, going to work. She was still sitting there when she heard the car. Not Walt's truck, something else smoother. A newer engine arriving up the gravel track in a way that had no tentativeness about it, the approach of a car whose driver felt entitled to the road, to the space, to the information. Lee knew the sound of that engine before the car cleared the tree line. She stood up. The silver sedan came out of the oaks and stopped in the yard. Garrett Holt got out of the car and stood in the yard and looked at the property. He did what he always did when he arrived in a new space. He assessed it. He looked at the house, the workshop, the garden, the orchard, the way he looked at anything that represented a potential claim, turning slowly, taking inventory, calculating. He put his hands in his pockets. "This is what Earl left," he said. "This is what Earl built," Lee said. "There's a difference." Garrett walked toward the house. He stepped onto the porch and examined the railing that boards the front door. He ran his hand along the porch post the way someone assesses the quality of something that might become relevant to them. Then he turned and looked at the orchard. "How many acres?" 53. Garrett nodded slowly. His expression was the one she had spent 11 years learning to read. Calculating distance, measuring the gap between what he was looking at and what he might be able to do about it. Sadie came back from the orchard. She stopped at the edge of the yard when she saw Garrett's car. Lee met her eyes and held them for a moment. "Sadie, honey, take Birch and check on the hive platforms for me." Sadie looked at her father, then back at Lee. Then she looked at the dog. "Come on, Birch." She walked toward the beehives and Birch stood and followed her. Garrett watched them go. Then he looked at Lee. "You should have disclosed this in the settlement," he said. His voice had the particular patience of a man who wants to sound reasonable and knows that sounding reasonable is a form of leverage. "There was nothing to disclose. I didn't know about it." "You didn't know your father owned 53 acres. Nobody knew. He kept it to himself for 36 years. Garrett crossed his arms. "That's convenient." Lee felt something old and familiar move through her chest. The tightening, the reflexive constriction that had been her body's response to Garrett's skepticism for 11 years. The pull toward explanation, toward justification, toward making herself more credible by making herself smaller, more manageable, easier for him to dismiss. She let the feeling arrive. She let it sit. She did not move her weight. "My father purchased this land in October of 1988, she said. "I was 2 years old. He paid taxes on it from a post office box for 36 years. His name is the only name on the deed. It passed to me through his estate after the divorce was finalized. There is nothing here that touches our settlement, Garrett. Not 1 acre and not $1. Garrett looked at her for a long time. The expression on his face moved through several configurations. She recognized the reasonable mask. The considering mask, the mask that preceded a different approach when the current one wasn't working. "My mother thinks we should talk to a lawyer." Lee said nothing. "I'm just trying to be civil about this," he said. You drove 2 hours without telling me, she said. You're standing on property that belongs to me and suggesting my dead father's land should have been disclosed in a settlement he never knew was coming. That's not civil, Garrett. That's what you've always done. The words came out of her the way words come out when you've thought them for months and finally say them in the right sequence in the right moment to the right person. She watched them land. Garrett's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to lines being drawn. For 11 years, Lee had been a person who retreated from pressure, who yielded on small things until the small things added up to a life in which she stood at the margins while he stood at the center. The drawing of a line looked unfamiliar on her. He didn't know yet what to do with it. He walked back to his car. He got in without saying anything else. He drove back down the track through the oaks, and the sound of his engine faded into the trees. Lee stood on the porch until the sound was gone completely. Her hands were steady at her sides. She was still standing there when Walt's truck came up the drive 10 minutes later. He had seen the silver sedan from up the road, he said. He'd waited until it left. He'll push on it legally, Walt said. He sat down in the porch chair and looked at the orchard. I know, you need a lawyer. I'll find one. There's a woman in town. Does property and estate work. Good reputation. Name's Hollis. Her office is on Merchant Street above the hardware store. Lee went to see her on Monday. She was a compact, direct woman who wore reading glasses on a chain and listened to the full story without interrupting. She reviewed the deed and the probate paperwork and looked up from them after 4 minutes of reading. This is separate property, she said. Your father acquired it 36 years before your marriage. It was never in joint title. It was never commingled with marital assets. He did not live there. Your name was never on the deed. It came to you through his estate after the divorce was final. Your former husband has no claim here. None. Can he file motions? He can file anything he likes. A judge would dismiss it quickly. And if his attorney is competent, they'll tell him the same thing I'm telling you before he spends money on it. Lee paid the consultation fee and drove home with the attorney's assessment letter in an envelope on the passenger seat. She felt lighter in a specific way, not from the legal certainty alone, she had believed that already, but from having the certainty stated by someone whose job it was to know these things, to say them in language that could not be argued with in the ways that Garrett was practiced at arguing. She told Rowan about it the following Monday at the diner before the breakfast rush while she was refilling the salt shakers. She told her about the deed in the Bible, the property, the house Earl had built, the furniture with the labels. She told her about Garrett's visit and the lawyer. Rowan set down her pen and looked at Lee over the counter. Your father built an entire farm for you and never told you. 36 years, Lee said. Rowan was quiet for a moment. She had 3 grown children and a marriage that had lasted 32 years, and she didn't fill silences with noise. The quietest people build the loudest things, she said finally. My grandfather was the same way. Never said what he was thinking. Just showed up one season with 40 acres of field he'd cleared himself and stood back and waited for everyone to figure out what it meant. She looked at Lee. Is it a good farm? It's a beautiful farm. Then go be on it. Garrett's mother arrived 2 weekends later. Lee was turning soil in the garden beds when the unfamiliar car came up the drive, a cream-colored Buick that moved with the self-assurance of its owner. The woman who got out was in her mid-60s, dressed for a suburb, pressed and composed. Lee had sat across from her at 14 years of holiday dinners. She knew the posture. She knew the expression that preceded a conversation this woman had already decided the outcome of before arriving. Garrett's mother walked across the yard looking at the property the way someone looks at a problem they are there to solve. Lee, she said, you're being very difficult about this. I'm not being anything, Lee said. I'm gardening. You have property that could affect the settlement, and you're refusing to discuss it with Garrett. The property doesn't affect the settlement. My lawyer has sent Garrett a letter explaining this clearly. The woman walked a few steps toward the house, looking at the porch, the shutters, the workshop. Her expression did that thing people do when they have already decided something and are arranging their face around the conclusion. Earl was a parks maintenance worker, she said. He mowed lawns for a county paycheck. I find it difficult to believe he built something worth fighting over. A voice came from the direction of the workshop. Walt had come down from his place without Lee hearing his approach. He was standing near the workshop doors with his cap in his hands, and he was looking at Garrett's mother with the patient steadiness of a man who has nothing to prove and has learned over a long life that this is the most powerful position available to a person. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't believe we've met." The woman looked at him. "And you are?" "Walt Pruitt, Earl Calloway's neighbor for close to 30 years. "I see." Walt put his cap back on and stepped forward slowly without hurry. "Earl Calloway was a parks maintenance worker," he said. "That's correct. On weekdays, he went home to a one-bedroom apartment that didn't have much in it. But every Friday night or Saturday morning for 30 years, that man drove 2 hours to this property and he worked. He built the house with his own hands. He poured the foundation, framed the walls, hung the doors, glazed the windows, laid the floors. He built every piece of furniture in that workshop. He planted every tree in that orchard. He ran the water line from the spring on his own with hand tools by himself because there was nobody else to do it. He did all of it on a groundskeeper's wages on weekends over 3 decades, and he left it to his daughter." Walt looked at her steadily. He left his daughter a life, not a fortune, a life. And if your son or anyone else thinks they're going to take that away from her, they'd better come with more than an opinion about groundskeepers. Garrett's mother looked at Walt. She looked at Lee. She looked at the farm one more time. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She had come here expecting to find something she could diminish. She had found something she couldn't. She walked back to her car and drove down the track without another word. Walt watched the Buick disappear into the oaks. He put his cap back on his head and straightened the brim. Then he walked back up the road without saying anything further because nothing further needed to be said. The legal situation resolved itself within the following 2 weeks. Garrett called on a Thursday evening, his voice arranged into a careful neutrality. "My attorney says there's no claim," he said. "I know. I wasn't trying to take anything from you." Lee didn't answer that. They both knew what was and wasn't true. He said, "I just wanted to understand the situation." "Now you do," she said. He hung up. She set the phone on the kitchen table, Earl's table, and looked out the window at the orchard in the late afternoon light. She felt a door close. Not with a slam, the way Earl would have done it if Earl had ever needed to close a door on something. Quietly and finally, with no drama, because the closing was not a performance. It was just done. She was sleeping at the farm on weekends now, on the factory-sealed mattress she'd finally cut open and aired out in the bedroom with the east-facing window. The first morning she woke there, the light came through the window at the angle Earl had intended it to come, falling across the foot of the bed and the floor reaching just to the edge of the room's shadow. She lay still for a few minutes and watched the light move as the sun cleared the tree line. She understood what he had built the window for. The fourth letter took her 2 more weeks to find. She was cleaning the bedroom nightstand, pulling the drawer all the way out to wipe the tracks, when she flipped it over and saw the envelope taped to the underside. White, slightly yellowed at the edges, the number 4 in pencil. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. This letter was shorter than the others. Earl wrote about the wood stove, how to light it in sequence, the damper positions for starting and for running, what kind of wood burned cleanest. He'd cut and stacked a cord of seasoned oak behind the workshop, he wrote. Should last through 2 winters if she didn't run it hot every night. Then the bedroom window faces east. I built it that way on purpose. The first light hits the orchard. I wanted you to see the trees every morning before you started your day. I wanted the orchard to be the first thing you saw and the last thing you thought about. It took me 3 tries to get the framing right for that window. The second framing sat an inch too high and the angle was wrong. I pulled it out and did it again. Some things are worth the extra effort to get exactly right. She held the letter for a long moment, then placed it in the nightstand drawer with the others. She was sleeping here, waking to the light he had engineered for her, looking at the orchard before she started her day. He had imagined this. He had built toward it. And she was, without knowing she was doing it, living inside the life he had designed for her. The 5th letter took her 3 more weeks to locate. She was in the bedroom one Sunday evening before the drive back to Beckley, moving the bookshelf to check the floor beneath it for any soft spots in the boards. She pulled it away from the wall and saw the envelope taped to the back panel. White, slightly yellow, the number 5 in pencil. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. It was the longest letter yet. 2 full pages front and back, the handwriting getting progressively smaller toward the bottom of each page as Earl ran out of room and kept going anyway. He wrote, "This is the letter I've been putting off." He wrote that he had bought the land the year before Lee was born. Her mother was unhappy in the marriage, he wrote, and he had known it and had not known what to do about it. He had not been able to give her what she needed because he did not know what that was. And by the time he understood it was something words were supposed to do, the words weren't available to him. So he had done what he knew how to do. He had bought 53 acres with money saved from before Lee was born, and he had driven south on a Friday evening and stood in a field in the dark and decided to build something. He had not known yet what he was building toward. He just knew he had to begin. He wrote that when Lee was born, the intention changed. It was for her now. Everything was for her now. He wrote about the wedding. He had sat in the third row in a good shirt that he'd bought for the occasion and watched Garrett the whole ceremony. He wrote that it wasn't anything dramatic that he'd seen, just a way Garrett had of touching Lee's elbow when they turned for photographs. Not guiding, positioning. Earl wrote that he knew that gesture because he had felt a version of it himself in his own marriage, applied by a different hand in a different direction, but the same underlying thing. A person arranging another person without asking. He had driven back to the farm that night and worked until dark without stopping, because the working was the only thing that answered the feeling when the feeling was too large for words. He wrote that he had finished the house that fall, planted 20 trees the following spring, stocked the root cellar for the first time. Then he wrote, "I want to tell you about a day I've never told anyone about." The summer Lee and Garrett had been married for 3 years, Earl had driven to the farm with a folder in the passenger seat. Inside the folder was a letter from a real estate agent in Dunmore County and a blank signature line on a property transfer document. He had made contact with a buyer, a farmer from 2 counties east, who was looking to expand his orchard operation. The price was fair. He had stood in the orchard for 2 hours that day. He had looked at the trees he had planted. The oldest ones were 15 years old by then, their trunks solid, their canopies full. He had walked the rows the way he walked them every weekend. He had gone into the house and stood in the kitchen and put his hand on the counter. He had gone into the workshop and looked at the furniture he had started building, the first pieces, not yet finished, still in raw wood. He had not been able to sign. "I stood there with the folder in my hand," he wrote, "and I thought about how you were small, how you used to fall asleep holding on to whatever your hand could find, the edge of a blanket, a shirt collar, and even asleep you'd hold on like letting go meant something bad would happen. I thought about how you learned to be still when things got hard, how you never made a sound when things hurt. And I put the folder back in the truck and I went and got my tools and I worked until it was too dark to see. I kept building." Lee sat on the bed in the room Earl had built and held the letter in both hands and read the last paragraph twice. He wrote, "I'm sorry I couldn't fight what was happening to you the way a person fights a person. I couldn't be the kind of father who says the right thing at the right moment. The words were never there when I needed them. But I could be the kind of father who makes sure there's somewhere to land. That's what this place is, Lee. Not a farm, not a project. It's the only thing I had instead of the words. I see you. I always saw you. I wasn't going to let you fall, even if you had to fall first before you found this place. I love you. I should have said it every day. Dad." She sat on the bed with the letter in her lap for a long time after she finished reading it. The light in the bedroom was going, the sun behind the hills, the orchard outside the east window settling into its evening stillness. She could hear the birds moving through the trees, the soft sounds of a place doing what it does at the end of a day when nothing is being asked of it. He had been here for all of it. Every weekend she had not called. Every Sunday morning, she had assumed she understood the shape of his life while he was 2 hours south of her building, the answer to a question she hadn't yet learned to ask. He had been in this room, in this orchard, in this workshop, and she had been somewhere else not paying attention. That was the thing she kept arriving at. Not that he had hidden it from her, that she had not looked. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the nightstand drawer with the others. Then she sat for another moment thinking about the numbering. She had found the letters marked 0, 2, 3, 4, and 5. She had not yet found letter 6. Somewhere on this property it was waiting. Earl had said she'd find them when she was ready. She was beginning to understand that he had known something about readiness that she was still learning. That it was not a state you arrived at, but a thing you grew into incrementally, the way you grow into any truth that is larger than your current understanding of yourself. She got up and walked out through the kitchen and stood on the porch in the evening air and looked at the orchard and breathed in the smell of grass and turned earth and the faint sweetness that had no name but that she had been aware of her whole life. The dog was on the edge of the yard watching her. His tail moved once. She gave notice at the fulfillment center on a Wednesday evening, standing in the break room before the start of the night shift, handing a folded piece of paper to the shift supervisor, a man named Aldous who had worked there for 11 years and had the particular exhaustion of someone who had stopped counting. He took the paper and looked at it and looked at her and said, "You sure?" She said she was sure. He nodded and put the paper in his shirt pocket, and that was that. She called the diner the next morning. Rowan answered and Lee told her. And Rowan said, "Good, it's about time." And then neither of them said anything for a moment. And then Rowan said, "Bring me a jar of that honey when you're settled." And Lee said she would and meant it. She told Garrett the following Sunday at the custody exchange. She kept it factual the way her lawyer had advised her to keep all communications with Garrett clear, specific without elaboration that could be reinterpreted. She was moving to the farm in Dunmore County. She was enrolling Sadie in the elementary school in Draper, which was 11 miles from the property, and had a morning bus route that ran within a quarter-mile of the front gate. She wanted to discuss adjusting the custody schedule to reflect the new distance. Garrett stood in the doorway of his house on Elm Fork Road and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. She watched him work through it. The property fight was settled. The legal avenue had closed. And now the woman who had lived for 8 months above a laundromat packing boxes at 2 in the morning was standing on his porch telling him she was moving to a 53-acre farm 2 hours south and taking their daughter with her. "You're serious," he said. She said she was. He looked past her at the car in the driveway. He looked at the street. He was doing the thing he did when he was searching for the angle that served him. And she could see the search happening in real time, and she could see the moment he understood there wasn't one. "Fine," he said. "We'll work something out." It wasn't much, but it was more accommodation than she'd expected, and she accepted it without comment and drove home and began to pack. The apartment took 2 hours to clear. She had been surprised when she moved in by how little she had after the divorce. She was no longer surprised. She had spent 8 months learning exactly what she needed and what she didn't, and the knowledge had simplified everything down to its actual dimensions. The pull-out couch was rented. The dishes were from the thrift store on Maple Avenue. Her clothes fit in 3 canvas bags. Sadie's things from the weekends fit in a backpack and a small duffel. She peeled the list off the refrigerator door. The 2-column list, "Pay now and pay when you can," written in black marker on the back of a takeout menu. She stood in the middle of the empty apartment holding it and looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it once and put it in the trash bag by the door. She loaded the rented truck on a Saturday morning in early June when the air was already warm and the light had the quality it gets in West Virginia in early summer, thick and golden and unhurried. Sadie carried her backpack to the cab and climbed in and buckled her belt without being asked. Lee closed the back of the truck. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the apartment window above the laundromat. The glass reflected the street. The window was dark. The building was vibrating from the washers below the spin cycle, the same one she'd felt through the floor at 2 in the morning for 8 months, the same low pulse she'd stopped noticing, because you stop noticing the things that are always there. She looked at the window for a moment longer. Then she turned away from it and got in the truck. They drove south. The farm looked different in June than it had in March when she'd first come through the gate. The orchard was in full leaf, the canopy dense and green, the rows of trees filling in the spaces between them with shadow and movement. The garden beds she'd planted in April were coming up tomato plants a foot tall. The beans twisting up their strings, herbs spreading at the corners of the raised beds, in the disorganized abundance that herbs have when they decide a place suits them. The grass in the yard was long enough to need cutting, which Earl's push mower in the workshop could handle once she'd gotten the engine running. Birch was waiting at the gate when they pulled through. He stood in the middle of the drive and watched the truck come up the track, his ears forward, his tail held level. When Lee cut the engine and opened the door, he stepped back to give her room and then sat down and looked at her directly. She crouched down and held out her hand. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. Then he pressed his nose briefly against her palm and stepped back again. It was an acknowledgement. It was enough. Sadie was out of the cab before Lee had straightened up, running across the yard to Birch, who stood for her contact with the patience he had developed over the previous months, absorbing her embrace with the stillness of a dog who has decided someone is worth the adjustment. Walt came down from his place an hour after they arrived. He helped carry the boxes, in which there were not many of, and he carried them with the directness of a man who doesn't make a ceremony of usefulness. When they were done, he sat on the porch, and Lee poured coffee from the thermos she'd brought, and they looked at the orchard for a while without saying much. "You're home," Walt said. Lee held her coffee cup in both hands. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." The school district was straightforward. The principal at Draper Elementary was a woman named Beverly Marsh, who had been running the school for 16 years and had the particular competence of someone who has solved every version of a problem multiple times and has stopped being surprised by any of them. She walked Lee through the enrollment paperwork and asked about Sadie's reading level, and when Lee mentioned the custody arrangement and the distance from Garrett, Beverly nodded without making it complicated. "We have several families with split county arrangements," she said. "The bus comes down County Road 7 at 7:15. Sadie will be fine." Sadie was fine. She was more than fine. She was the kind of child who walks into a new classroom and finds the one other child who is reading the most interesting book and sits down next to her. And within 2 weeks, she had 3 friends and a teacher who sent Lee a note saying Sadie had given a 5-minute impromptu presentation on apple grafting that the class had found genuinely fascinating and scientifically accurate. Lee learned the farm the way her father had learned it, by working it, by showing up every day and finding the thing that needed doing and doing it, and then finding the next thing. She serviced the push mower and cut the grass. She weeded the garden beds and staked the tomatoes and harvested the first beans in July, more than she could eat fresh, so she canned them the way Earl's root cellar notes had described, using the pressure canner he'd left on the workshop shelf. The instructions in his handwriting folded and tucked inside the canner's lid, where anyone who needed them would find them. She oiled the hand planes, linseed not tongue. The can was under the bench on the left side, exactly where he'd said it would be. She sharpened the chisels on the whetstone she found in the shallow drawer, the one above the pencils. She put on the gloves from the top drawer first. She did it methodically, working through the angle he'd marked on the tool rest with a pencil line, and when she lifted the first chisel and held it to the light and saw the edge run clean, and even she understood for the first time in a concrete and embodied way why he had been proud of the tools. Pride in a tool was not about the tool. It was about understanding the relationship between care and result. She started building in the workshop on Sunday afternoons after the outdoor work was done. She didn't have a plan at first. She stood at the workbench and looked at the pegboard and took down the combination square and marked a piece of scrap wood and made a cut and looked at it and made another. She was not building anything. She was learning the feel of the tools in her own hands, the way the plane responded to the grain, the way the saw wanted to drift if you let your attention wander. She was learning the language he had spoken his entire life, learning it clumsily, the way adults learn any language, by making mistakes and correcting them and making different mistakes. By August, she had built 2 chairs. They were not as good as Earl's. The mortise and tenon joints were slightly loose on one. The legs on the other were a 1/4 inch uneven on the right side, enough that a careful eye would notice. She carried them to the kitchen and set them at the table alongside the 2 chairs Earl had made, and looked at all 4 of them together. They held. They were solid, and they held. That was what mattered for now. The rest was practice. Walt said nothing about the unevenness. He sat in one of her chairs the following Saturday morning and drank his coffee and looked at the orchard and did not mention the slight list to the right. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. She found letter 6 on a Sunday afternoon in late August while reorganizing the workshop, clearing the space under the back corner of the workbench to make room for winter woodworking. Her hand found something she hadn't noticed before. A tin tube about 18 inches long, the kind used for storing rolled documents. Its color was close enough to the gray concrete that it had been effectively invisible. She pulled it out and looked at it. The cap was sealed with a ring of electrical tape that had gone stiff with age. She worked the tape off carefully and pulled the cap. Inside, rolled tightly, were several sheets of paper. She unrolled them on the workbench, weighting the corners with chisels to hold them flat. They were drawings, architectural drawings in pencil and ink done by hand with a straight edge. Precise, carefully dimensioned with elevation views and floor plans and detailed sketches of specific joints and connections. The house fully drawn with every measurement noted. The workshop with the pegboard system laid out in detail, each tool space marked. The root cellar showing the hillside cross-section and the shelf layout and the door construction. The garden beds with dimensions and orientation relative to the sun. The orchard with each planting location marked in pencil, the grid laid out to scale varieties labeled by row. She spread them across the bench and stood back and looked at all of them together. The date on the first sheet was October 1988, the month he'd recorded the deed. He had drawn all of this before he broke a single piece of ground, before he framed a single wall or drove a single stake. He had sat down with a pencil and a straight edge and drawn the house and the workshop and the root cellar and the orchard, measured and proportioned and detailed, and he had known exactly what he was building before he started. Not in a general way, specifically. The number of trees, their spacing, the varieties in their rows, the orientation of the bedroom window toward the morning light. All of it committed to paper in October of 1988. She went through each sheet slowly. In the corner of every page, in the same small, careful handwriting she had been reading all year, 2 words. For when she needs it. Not for someday. For when. He had known with the particular certainty of a man who had decided something and would not be moved from it, that there would come a time when his daughter would need a place. He had designed it 36 years before she arrived. He had built it to the plan. He had followed the blueprint sheet by sheet, season by season, through 3 decades of Saturday mornings. And what stood outside the workshop walls was the material realization of what he had drawn one October night in 1988. She stood at the workbench with the blueprint spread out under her hands and thought about the precision of love. The way it sometimes looks like nothing and is actually the most carefully considered thing a person has ever done. She took the blueprints inside and spread them on the kitchen table and sat with them for a long time. The lamp on the property quiet around her, the orchard dark outside the window. She thought about all the things she had assumed she understood. She thought about how many of those assumptions had been wrong, and how the wrongness of them was not a failure of love on either side, but a failure of visibility, of paying attention to the right things at the right time. The farmers market in Draper ran on Saturday mornings from June through October in the parking lot of the old hardware cooperative on Merchant Street. Lee arrived on the second Saturday of August with 2 folding tables, 14 bags of apples sorted by variety, and 16 jars of honey from the summer's first extraction, the labels handwritten on cardstock she'd cut at the kitchen table the night before. Callaway Ridge. She had written it in a plain hand, nothing decorative, because the name didn't need decoration. It stood on its own. She set up between a woman named Greta, who sold beeswax candles and had been at the market for 9 years, and a man named Burwell who grew heirloom tomatoes and sweet corn and arrived every Saturday in a truck that seemed to be held together by principle rather than mechanics. The apples sold well. The honey sold faster. By 11:30, the honey was gone. By noon, the apples were down to 2 bags. She sold those to a woman with a stroller who asked if the farm was organic, and Lee said she honestly didn't know what Earl had put on the trees over the years, but that she herself hadn't put anything on them and didn't plan to. The woman bought both bags. Greta, packing up her candle display beside her, looked at the empty tables. Good first week, she said. Lee folded the first table. Your bees make good honey, Greta said. My father's bees, Lee said. I'm just the new management. She came back the following Saturday with twice the apples and 12 more jars of honey. The honey was gone by 10:40. People who had bought a jar the week before came back for two more. A man in his 70s asked her about the variety, and she told him about the wine saps and the Arkansas blacks and the Newtown pippins, and he asked about the grafted stock, and she told him what Walt had told her. That Earl had checked out a library book and practiced on scrap wood and lost the first few grafts and kept going. The man looked at the jar of honey in his hand and said, "That's how you do anything right." Then he bought 3 jars and a bag of the pippins and said he'd be back. People began asking about the farm. Could they see it? Could they walk the orchard? She said yes, come out on a Saturday afternoon. And they came 3 that first time, then 5, then more. She walked them through the rows the way Walt had walked her, telling them what she now knew, which variety ran, which row, how Earl had determined spacing by standing between 2 stakes and extending his arms and deciding that was enough room for 2 trees to grow without competing for light. She told them about the grafting. She told them about the root cellar. She showed them the beehives from a respectful distance. People listened with a quality of attention she hadn't expected. They stood in the rows of apple trees and looked up at the canopy and went quiet, in the way that people go quiet when they are in a place that has absorbed decades of patient work, and they can feel it without being told it's there. The place carried what had been done in it. That was simply the truth of it. She told them about Earl only when they asked, which they always asked. Who planted all this? She told the story simply, without embellishment, without drama. A man who worked maintenance for the county parks department. He bought the land in 1988. He came every weekend for 36 years and built it piece by piece. He never told anyone. He left it to his daughter. People shook their heads. They looked at the trees. They bought more honey on their way out. It was the 3rd Saturday of September when the young woman stopped at her table. She was mid-20s with a toddler on her hip and the particular look of someone who has been managing too much for too long and has stopped expecting it to get easier. She bought a jar of honey and a bag of pippins and then stood at the edge of the table without moving, holding the bag, looking at the apples. I heard you live out there alone, the woman said. With your daughter. I do. How do you do it? She asked it directly without preface, the way people ask questions when they've run out of time for the ones that lead up to the real one. I don't know how to fix anything. My husband left and the kitchen faucet has been dripping for 2 months, and I can't afford a plumber, and every time I look at it, I feel like I can't do anything right. Lee looked at her. She recognized the expression. Not despair exactly. Something worse than despair, the feeling that the list of things you don't know how to do is longer than the list of things you do, and that the gap is permanent. Come out to the farm next Saturday, Lee said. I'll show you how to fix a faucet. The woman's name was Petra. She came the following Saturday with a friend named Darlene, and Lee showed them both how a faucet worked from the inside the cartridge, the seat, the washer, and where the shutoff valve was, and why knowing where it was mattered more than almost anything else. She showed them how to identify which part was leaking and how to replace it for under $4 in parts from the hardware store. She let them each take the faucet apart and put it back together. Darlene's worked on the first try. Petra's leaked at the connection until they tightened the packing nut another quarter turn and then it held. Petra stood at the kitchen sink with the water running clean and looked at her own hands. I've been afraid of it for 2 months, she said. The next Saturday, 4 women came. Lee showed them how to put up tomatoes in a water bath canner. She set up the big pot on the propane burner outside and went through the process step by step. The sterilization, the blanching and peeling, the headspace, the timing, and when the jars came out of the canner and the lids began to seal one by one with that small, definitive pop, every woman in the yard looked up at the sound. Burwell from the farmer's market brought over a half bushel of tomatoes and sat on the porch steps and watched without saying anything. Walt came down from his place and sat in the porch chair and watched without saying anything. By the end of the afternoon, each woman had 4 sealed jars of tomatoes and knew exactly how they got in there. Lee called it a workshop, though that was not quite the right word for it. It was more like a morning on a farm where people learned things they needed to know and had coffee and walked through the orchard and left less afraid of their own lives than when they arrived. By October, there were 8 or 10 women coming most Saturdays. Lee taught them what she knew, which was increasingly a lot, and what she didn't know she looked up in Earl's reference books on the workshop shelf. And sometimes she got things slightly wrong, and they figured it out together, which turned out to be its own kind of instruction. She taught them how to read a property deed. That one surprised her how many of them had documents they'd signed without understanding how many of them felt uncertain about what they owned and what claim others might have on it. She spread a copy of Earl's deed on the kitchen table and went through it section by section. The legal description, the parcel number, the recording date, the chain of title. She told them what her lawyer had told her, the difference between separate and marital property, the importance of having a document analyzed before you signed it. Petra, who had fixed her own faucet and put up 30 jars of tomatoes over 2 Saturdays, asked Lee a question near the end of one of those October mornings that stayed with her long after the morning was over. "Is it really yours?" Petra asked. "Like all of it, nobody can come and take it." Lee looked at her across the kitchen table. "It's mine," she said. "My father made sure of that long before I needed it to be true." Petra nodded. She looked at the kitchen at the counter Earl had made from a single wide plank of wood at the window that looked out over the orchard. "How does it feel?" she asked. Lee thought about it honestly. "Like home," she said. "Like a place where nobody can make me leave." The custody arrangement adjusted itself over the fall into something that worked. Garrett got Sadie Monday through Wednesday. Lee got her Thursday through Sunday. The distance was real but manageable, and Garrett had not pushed back on the schedule in the ways she'd expected, which she understood was not generosity, but the recognition that fighting it would cost him more than accepting it. She accepted the outcome without needing to understand the motivation. That was new for her. She was getting better at letting the reason be less important than the result. Sadie loved the farm with the wholehearted and practical love that children have for places that give them room. She had a section of the orchard she considered specifically hers, the 3 youngest grafted trees in the eastern row, which she watered herself and checked for insects, and had named those she had not told Lee the names yet, and Lee had not asked. She collected pine cones from the base of the old oaks and arranged them along the bedroom windowsill in an order she declined to explain. She had stopped flinching when she heard loud noises, which she had done all summer, and Lee noted the absence of it without remarking on it, because some things get better quietly, and that is the right way for them to get better. Birch met the school bus at the end of the drive every afternoon, arriving at the gate 3 minutes before it appeared by some internal clock Lee had stopped questioning. He stood at the gate, and when the bus door opened and Sadie came down the steps, his tail went in wide arcs, the fullest motion he was capable of, which was not small. He slept at the foot of Lee's bed. He walked the orchard with her in the mornings, one ear always angled toward the tree line, tracking the property even while they moved. He was not the watchful, half-wild animal she had first seen from the car in March. He was a dog who had found where he belonged and had committed to it completely. Lee understood this better than she had at the beginning of the year. October moved into November. The wine saps finished first picked and sorted and sold and put up. The Arkansas blacks came next, dark and dense, holding their flavor in the root cellar through the winter without losing anything. The Newtown Pippins, last green, going gold sweet and crisp, the ones the market customers asked for by name after the first week they appeared on the table. She picked the last of the Pippins on a Thursday afternoon with Sadie, the two of them working through the row in the low November light, filling the wooden crates Earl had built and stored in the workshop for exactly this use. Sadie worked methodically, checking each apple before she picked it the way Lee had taught her. She sang to herself while she worked something shapeless and tuneless that she seemed unaware she was doing. "This is what Grandpa did every fall," Sadie said at one point, not asking, just stating it. "Every fall for 30 years, Lee said. Sadie looked up at the branches. "So he picked these apples. He picked the ones on the older trees. These younger ones he wouldn't have gotten to yet." Sadie considered this. So we're finishing it, she said. Lee looked at the tree in front of her, its branches thinning as they took the last of the fruit. The leaves mostly down now, the sky visible through the canopy where it hadn't been in August. Yeah, she said. I think we are. Garrett brought Sadie on a Friday evening in early November, earlier than usual, dropping her before dinner. He got out of the car in the yard, which he sometimes did now, a change from the early months. He had stopped sitting in the car with the engine running. Lee was not sure what to make of the change and had decided not to make anything of it. He was carrying a manila folder. Sadie ran to Lee and then ran to the orchard calling for Birch, who appeared from between the trees at the sound of her voice and loped toward her in a steady, unhurried way. Garrett stood in the yard holding the folder. He looked at the house, at the green shutters Lee had painted in September at the porch, with its 2 chairs and the wood stove she'd had connected in October. He looked at the orchard in the fading light. He looked at it differently than he had in the spring, not assessing. Something more neutral than that. Something that might have been if you were willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, respect. She talks about this place constantly, he said. Sadie did. Lee knew this not from Garrett, but from what Sadie said on Thursday mornings when Lee picked her up, the way she narrated her week at Garrett's house. As a prelude to being back at the farm, describing Draper and the orchard and Birch, and the Saturday workshops, the way you describe home when you're away from it. He held out the folder. Her teacher sent these. She said you should see them. Lee took the folder and opened it. Inside were 6 drawings in colored pencil on white paper. Sadie's best work, the kind she did when she wasn't hurrying. The orchard in October, the trees in full color, warm reds and golds and greens against a blue-gray sky. Birch on the porch steps in the morning, one ear up his eyes on the yard. The root cellar interior, the shelves lined with jars, each one labeled in Sadie's printing, smaller than her usual hand, more careful. The workshop from inside, the tools on the pegboard, the furniture that remained there waiting for the rooms she and Lee hadn't built yet. The farmhouse itself from the yard, late afternoon light on the wood siding, smoke from the stovepipe. And the last one, a man standing in the rows of the orchard. His proportions were a child's proportions, slightly large hands, a face with simple features. Boots. He held a hammer in one hand and an envelope in the other. Above his head, small and slightly crooked, drawn in yellow, a halo. Lee held the drawing and looked at it. Garrett stood nearby. That's Earl, he said. Sadie came back from the orchard with Birch beside her. She looked at the drawing in Lee's hands and nodded. That's Grandpa Earl, she said. I put a halo on him. I can see that, Lee said. She kept her voice even. Why a small one? Because he was quiet, Sadie said. I figured his halo would be quiet too. Lee looked at the drawing. The man in the orchard with the hammer and the envelope, and the small crooked halo in yellow pencil above his head. She held it for a long moment. Then she held it for another. Garrett stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets looking at the farm. He looked at the orchard. He looked at the house. His expression had none of the calculating quality it had carried in the spring. He looked like a man who was seeing something he had underestimated and was doing the private, honest arithmetic of that recognition. He said she's happy here. She is, Lee said. He nodded slowly. He said goodnight to Sadie and got in the car and drove back down the track through the oaks. Lee watched the headlights disappear into the trees. She felt nothing particular. Not relief, not anger, not the complicated residue of 11 years. Just the neutral quiet of a thing that had finished. A chapter read through to the end, the book closed not with ceremony, but with the simple fact of the last page turning. She looked at the drawing of Earl in the orchard. Then she went inside and put it on the bedroom wall beside the east-facing window where the morning light would find it. She found the 7th letter in September, which was technically before the events of November, but memory does not always organize itself chronologically. And when she thought about the letters afterward, she placed the last one in its own space, apart from the sequence of the others, because it was different from the others in ways that resisted being put in order. She had been checking the wine sap row on a morning in mid-September, working through the tree-by-tree assessment she did every few days as the harvest approached, testing the firmness of each cluster and checking the color at the calyx end. She was near the south end of the row, working her way through the last few trees, when her hand reached up to test a cluster near the top of the oldest tree in the planting, the first tree Earl had put in the ground in 1990, the one whose trunk had thickened over 34 years to the diameter of a fence post, whose bark was deeply channeled and gray and carried the writing of decades in every furrow. Her fingers found the hollow before she was looking for it. A natural knothole in the trunk, larger than it appeared from below, opening into a cavity about the size of a fist. She felt something inside. Smooth plastic. She pulled out a small Ziploc bag. Inside the bag, an envelope. The number 7 in pencil. She sat down at the base of the tree. Birch was working his way through the row behind her nose to the ground, and he came to her when she stopped and lay down beside her without being invited, pressing his flank against her leg. She opened the envelope. The letter was one page. The handwriting was smaller than in the earlier letters, as though Earl had known how much space he had and was careful not to exceed it. As though he had measured this too. He wrote, "You found them all. That means you know every corner of this place. Good. It belongs to you now, and it knows you belong to it." He wrote that he did not have instructions this time. She didn't need them. Then I want to tell you something I should have said in person. He wrote that he had bought the land in October of 1988 when Lee was 2 years old. Not because he had a plan yet, not because he knew what he was building toward, but because 2 years before in the delivery room at Raleigh General, the nurse had placed a 7-pound girl in his arms, and he had looked at her face, and he had known immediately and with complete certainty two things at once: that he loved her more than he had understood love to be possible, and that he was going to fail her in some important way. Not because he didn't love her, because he had never learned how to say it. His father had not said it. His father's father had not said it. He had spent his childhood watching the men around him express what they felt through building and fixing and maintaining and showing up through presence and labor and the craftsmanship of attention. And he had absorbed that language so completely that when the moment came for words, he did not have them. He had never developed them. They were a foreign tongue he had never been taught. He wrote, "Men in this family build things. It's the only language we ever learned for love. I knew from the day I held you that the words I needed weren't going to come. So I decided to build something instead. Something that would say what I couldn't say in a language I actually knew. Something that would still be standing when the words would have been forgotten." He wrote about the nights he had driven home from the farm, south to north on the state road, tired in his bones, his hands marked from the tools, the truck cabs smelling like sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular sweetness of applewood when you cut into it. He wrote that those drives were the best part of his weeks. Not because they were comfortable, because on those drives he felt entirely himself. A man with a purpose that had a shape to it that he could see and touch and add to, that grew incrementally and held what he put into it. He wrote, "Every fall when the apples come in, that's me telling you. Every spring when the blossoms open, that's me again. I'll be in it every season, Lee. I built it that way on purpose." He wrote, "This isn't my farm anymore, it's yours. Take care of the bees, keep the root cellar stocked. Oil the plains twice a year, linseed, not tongue. You know the difference by now. And be happy. You've earned it." He wrote, "I love you. I should have said it every single day. I didn't. I'm sorry for that. I hope the trees say it for me. They'll be here longer than words. Love, Dad." Lee sat under the oldest apple tree on the property, the first tree Earl had planted in this ground, and she held the letter in both hands, and Birch pressed against her leg, and the September light came through the branches in pieces warm and specific, finding the spaces between the leaves. She did not read the letter a second time. She held it and looked up through the canopy at the sky above the orchard, the particular September blue that has more depth to it than summer blue, something added to it by the turn of the season, and she sat there until the feeling of it moved through her completely, all the way down, all of it. The grief and the recognition and the understanding that arrived too late and was still somehow exactly on time. She cried then, sitting at the base of the first tree Earl had ever planted on Callaway Ridge, with Birch's weight against her leg and the September light coming through the branches. She cried the way she had not cried since she was 11 years old and stood at the kitchen window and watched her mother's car turn the corner. She cried for Earl, for the man she had thought was empty and silent and absent, who had spent 3 decades building the answer to a question she hadn't known to ask. She cried for all the Sunday mornings she had hung up after 5 minutes and gone about her day. She cried until she was done, and then she sat quietly in the sound of the orchard, the wind in the leaves, the small movements of the trees, and let the quiet come back in. Then she folded the letter and held it against her chest. Men in this family build things. She thought about the chairs in the kitchen, the ones she had made herself slightly imperfect, the joints a little loose on one, the legs uneven on the other. She thought about the quarter-inch of unevenness in the leg that Walt had not mentioned. She thought about the first plane stroke she'd taken, feeling the tool resist, and then comply, the grain of the wood determining the direction of everything. She thought about what it meant to learn a language in your 40s, the clumsiness of it, the necessity of it, the way you made mistakes and corrected them and made different mistakes and corrected those and kept going because the keeping going was the whole of it. She put the letter in her jacket pocket with the folded blueprints she'd taken to carrying with her when she walked the property, and she stood up and she picked 3 wine saps from the branches above her, warm from the sun, and carried them to the house. December came in on a hard frost. The grass in the yard was white at 7 in the morning when Lee stepped onto the porch with her coffee, the cold hitting her face with the specific authority of a West Virginia December that means it without apology. The orchard was bare now, the leaves long down the branches, dark against the pale sky. In the bare trees, she could see the shape of what Earl had built more clearly than she could in Leaf. The structure of it, the intention encoded in the spacing and the varieties and the orientation of the rows, everything placed with reason, everything following the plan he had drawn in October of 1988 and followed without deviation for 36 years. She stood on the porch in the cold and looked at it and understood again, as she had been understanding it in increments all year, the patience required to plant a tree and accept that the fruit was 30 years away. The kind of faith that doesn't need to be told it's faith because it's too busy working to notice what it is. Walt came down at 8 with his cap pulled low against the cold and sat in the porch chair and accepted the coffee she poured from the thermos. Birch settled between the chairs, his breath fogging in the cold air. Inside, Sadie was drawing at the kitchen table, the small sounds of pencil on paper audible through the window. She had been working on something for 2 days and had not shown Lee yet, which meant she was not finished and knew it. Walt held his cup with both hands. He was looking at the orchard. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said. Lee looked at him. "The day Earl first came to see this property," Walt said. "I remember it. Fall of 1988. I was out fixing the fence line on my north boundary, and I saw a truck pull off County Road 7. Old truck, older than the one he drove later. He got out and went through the gate and came up the track on foot." He paused. "I could see him from my fence line, not close but enough. He walked up through the trees and came out into the clearing, right about where your truck is parked now, and he stopped. He didn't look around. He didn't walk the boundary or pace off measurements or do any of the things you'd expect a man to do when he's looking at a piece of property he's considering buying. He just stood still." Walt turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He stood there for 10 minutes. I timed it because I was curious. Just stood in the middle of the clearing and looked at the hills to the south and the tree line and whatever it was he was listening to. And then he walked back to his truck and drove away." Lee looked at the spot in the yard where she parked her truck. "What did he say?" she asked. "When you talked to him about it later." Walt looked at the orchard. "He came and introduced himself the following week. When he came back with a shovel, he said his name and said he'd bought the parcel and planned to do some work on it. I asked what he thought of it when he'd first seen it. He thought about it for a while, the way he thought about everything. Then he said 2 words. That was all." Lee looked at Walt. "This is it," Walt said. "That's what he said." Then he went and got the shovel from the truck and started clearing ground for the first tree. Lee looked at the orchard. The bare branches held their form against the winter sky, each tree distinct, each one placed exactly where Earl had decided it should go. In October of 1988, on a blueprint, he drew the same month he recorded the deed. The oldest trunks were thick and gray. The youngest trees were still slender. All of them were exactly where they were supposed to be. She thought about a man standing alone in a clearing in October of 1988, before there was a house or a workshop or a single tree in the ground, before there was anything except the land and the hills and whatever he could see when he stood still and listened. Standing there for 10 minutes, then saying two words and meaning them with the full weight of his understanding. This is it. Then going to get a shovel. She thought about what it means to know where you're supposed to be, not the dramatic version of that knowledge, not a revelation or a vision or a voice from somewhere above, but the quiet version. The version that arrives without announcement, settles in the body like water finding its level, and asks only one thing of you. Begin. Just begin and keep going from there, and don't let urgency make your decisions, and correct what isn't right. And plant the tree even if the fruit is 30 years away. Walt drank the last of his coffee and set the cup on the porch railing. He looked at the orchard for another moment. Then he looked at Lee. He'd be glad, Walt said, to see what you've done with it. He'd be very glad. Lee held her cup and looked at the bare trees and the pale sky above them, and the low hills where the property's south boundary ran, and she breathed in the cold air which smelled like frost and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness that the apple trees held even in winter. Something in the bark, something that persisted through the cold and the bare months. Something that was there whether you could see the fruit or not. Inside, Sadie's pencil had gone quiet. After a moment, the back door opened and Sadie came out onto the porch in her coat and boots, carrying a sheet of paper carefully with both hands, the way you carry something you've worked on and want to arrive undamaged. She stood beside Lee's chair and held it out. I finished, she said. Lee took the drawing. It was the farm viewed from above the way you might see it from the South Ridge looking north. The house in its clearing, the workshop to the right, the orchard stretching back in its careful rows, the garden beds, the root cellar entrance set into the hillside, the beehives on their platform at the orchard's edge. Every element in its place, the proportions careful, the rows of trees crossing the page in their deliberate parallel lines. Each tree distinct, each one where it was supposed to be. In the margins, Sadie had written the name in her best printing, Callaway Ridge. It's perfect, Lee said. Sadie sat down on the porch steps and pulled Birch against her side. He lay down across her feet and accepted this without complaint, his chin on his paws, one ear cocked toward the orchard. The three of them sat on the porch in the December cold and looked at the orchard, and the cold was the kind of cold that clarifies everything, that strips away what's temporary and leaves only what holds, what was built to last, what was put here with enough care that it will still be standing long after the hands that built it are gone. The bare branches held, the rows held, the house behind them held every board and beam of it, as solid as the day Earl had set the last one in place, and stepped back and looked at it and known it was right. Lee reached into her jacket pocket and felt the folded letter there, the last one, the one she had carried since September. She did not take it out. She just held it through the fabric, felt the weight of the page, the specific weight of what it contained. All those words her father had finally found the language for, after a lifetime of building things instead. She looked at the orchard. The trees were bare and waiting. The way trees wait through winter, not dormant in any real sense, but gathered, holding everything they needed for the spring. Inside the wood, inside the cambium, inside the cells of the roots, deep in the frozen ground. Patient with the knowledge that the season would turn, because it always had, and there was no reason to doubt it would again. She thought about what Earl had said when he stood in this clearing for the first time. She thought about him going to get the shovel. She thought about 36 years of Saturday mornings. Every one of them a small act of beginning, a shovel in the ground, a plank set level, a tree in a hole, a letter written and folded and hidden somewhere. A daughter would find it when she was ready. She had been thinking of what Earl did as building, but it was also beginning. Again and again, every weekend, beginning again. Beginning the next tree, beginning the next board, beginning the next letter. beginning the life he was making for her piece by piece, season by season, in the only language he'd ever learned. She felt the weight of the last letter in her pocket every fall when the apples come in. She looked at the bare orchard in the December cold, and she understood that she was looking at him, not at what he'd left behind, at him. The spacing between the trees was his patience. The orientation of the rows was his attention. The first tree, the oldest one, was his beginning. The youngest grafted trees at the eastern boundary were his faith that there would be springs after him, harvests after him, someone to walk these rows and know what she was looking at. Every spring when the blossoms open, the cold moved through the clearing and the bare branches moved with it, a low sound in the trees, steady and continuous, the sound of a place that has been here a long time and plans to stay, the sound of wood that has weathered many winters and will weather more, the sound of something built to outlast the person who built it. She sat and listened to it. She let it be what it was. Inside the jacket pocket, her hand rested on the letter. In her other hand, the drawing Sadie had made the farm from above, every element in its place, the name written in the margin in a child's careful printing. In the chair beside her, Walt finished his coffee and set the cup down and sat looking at the orchard with the quiet ease of a man who has been coming to this porch for 30 years and expects to come back next Saturday. Lee looked at the spot in the yard where she parked her truck. She thought about standing in a clearing for 10 minutes with nothing in front of her but land and hills and whatever you can hear when you stand still enough to listen. She thought about knowing in the way that knowledge settles rather than arrives, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. She thought, this is it. Then she held the drawing and the letter and looked at the orchard and breathed in the cold air that smelled like frost and the faint sweetness of wood that keeps its nature through the winter. And she let the morning be what it was, and she did not look away.